All right. Good evening. We are looking at our fourth week, and we're looking at the Davidic covenant taken out of 2 Samuel 7 this week. Last week you saw my funnel diagram. This week is more the framework that we've been building towards. So this is looking down the funnel, if you will, as we look at this to help focus things up. And just to recap, this is more than a contract. A covenant is a bond in blood, and the Hebrew word for it was to cut a covenant. And so that is why we talk about the blood is so important. And then we have the 3 P's of the covenants. Paradise, like I mentioned on Sunday, either lost or slowly regained. And then progeny, looking at the line of having folks to come down after us, and then the presence of God. And that's what we're repeatedly building towards. And tonight we're going to emphasize the presence of God in the building of a temple. And that's where we're going to kick it off. Before we jump into David, is there anything residual from Abraham or Moses or Noah or Adam from the previous weeks? I've been talking most of those weeks, and so this is the one night we have a little wiggle room, so I wanted to put up for questions first before we jump in.
I think for me it's always somewhat unclear what, it isn't a contract. So what, and it's a people, not an individual. So how do you enforce it? If an individual breaks the 10 Commandments, I don't know if you understand where I'm going with this, but it's with a contract you would sue the person involved or bring criminal charges.
Right.
But here there's no. It's just loose.
And it's broader because it's, if you keep it, you're blessed.
Right.
If you don't, you're cursed.
The whole people, not just one person.
Right.
That doesn't seem fair.
That's very Western of you. with the emphasis on the individual. It's a very different understanding. I was talking with somebody this week, when we look at salvation, especially in the book of Revelations, it's with the ethnos, with the peoples. And all the peoples of the earth will be represented in heaven. It's not all the individuals of the earth will be represented in heaven. It's a very different perspective. And as Western individualists, we tend to lean that way. And if you look at even our theology in most of the American church, it's that individual, have you made a decision for Christ? And it's like, or are we expanding the kingdom of God? It's a very different perspective than what's presented often. But that's a great question, Ian. And we have to unlearn a little bit. What else?
I spent some time researching what Ishmael's, this crew, says about circumcision. And to me, it turns out it's just whatever's convenient for you. And it doesn't give any suggestion to me that the message was for all mankind. But it turned out that if it's convenient and it seemed like a head of a temple, a mosque, would be able to say, yes, everybody has to. It doesn't matter.
Right, and I'm not familiar enough with the Muslim traditions to speak to that, so.
Because I was curious again after we spoke about that recently, how our brothers and sisters, Islam, would read the commandment. And so I come up with, I don't understand how, what the rule is at all, and that doesn't appear to be a rule of any kind.
I'd have to do some more homework on that. I'm sorry. Yeah.
I don't recommend, well, if anyone else does any research, I'd like to hear their assessment of it.
Sure. What else? All right. Well, let us jump in. So tonight we need to put ourselves in perspective. So after the Mosaic covenant, they wandered through the wilderness for 40 years. Most of the folks that left Egypt were not allowed into the promised land. They had sent the spies ahead, and they were scared of the people because they were humongous and we're tiny. And, this land flowing of milk and honey, this paradise that was promised. God's like, okay, you complaining folks, we're going to let you die in the desert and your kids can have the promised land. So we see even Moses looking over into the promised land, and even Moses was not allowed to make it. One of the fascinating things, if you look at the history of Moses, supposedly he wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. Traditionally, that's, they're called the 5 books of Moses, the Torah. But he dies before the end of the 5th book, and so I'll let you do with that as you will. But traditionally, they're the 5 books of Moses. Joshua takes over the leadership, leads the people into the promised land. After Joshua, we have the judges, this very loose, people would rise up and people would listen to them, and they would give authority. Men and women were judges. And then they decide they want to be like everybody else, and they ask for a king. And that's where we get King Saul. Once again, I'm jumping over history very fast here. But Saul, was what everybody expected to be a king to look like. Handsome, tall, a mighty warrior, but his heart wasn't fully given to God. And that's where we get this idea of David being a man after God's own heart, as the New Testament calls him. And this is where God makes his covenant with David. Even David's family didn't think much of him. He, when Jesse is approached to say, when the prophet comes to bless one son as the king, he goes to all his sons and he goes, "Do you have any other sons?" Well, there's David out there in the field, but not David. And so, I love the verse where they ordain David as the king, the rightful king, anoint him. God looks at the outward, a man looks at the outward appearances, but God looks at the heart. And we see David as a man after God's own heart. And so we get to a very peaceful point in David's lifetime, and that's where we're going to start in 2 Samuel chapter 7. And once again, I'm reading from the Robert Alter translation. And I've noticed a couple typos. I didn't have time to go through it with the fine-tooth comb I try to do today, like I normally do, and I do apologize. But if you see something that's wrong, let us know, and we'll let everybody annotate it on their own. And it happened when the king was dwelling in his house, and the Lord had granted him respite all around from his enemies, that the king said to Nathan the prophet, "See, pray, I dwell in a cedar wood house, while the ark of God dwells within curtains," or the tabernacle, the tent. And Nathan said to the king, "Whatever is in your heart, go, do, for the Lord, Yahweh, is with you." And it happened on that night that the word of Yahweh came to Nathan, saying, "Go, say to my servant, to David, thus says Yahweh, is it you who should build me a house for me to dwell in? Have I dwelled in no house from the day I brought up the Israelites out of Egypt unto this day, but I've gone about in a tent and tabernacle? Wherever I went about among the Israelites, did I speak a word with any of the tribal chiefs of Israel, whom I charged to shepherd my people Israel, saying, why did you not build me a cedar wood house? And now, thus shall you say to my servant, to David, thus says Yahweh, the Lord of hosts, I myself took you from the pasture, from following the flocks, to be prince over my people, over Israel. And I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut down your enemies before you. And I will make you a great name, like the great name of the great of the earth. And I will set aside a place for my people, for Israel, and plant them, and they shall abide there and no longer quake. And the wicked shall no more afflict them as before, from the day that I appointed judges over my people Israel. And I will grant you respite from all your enemies. And Yahweh declares that it is He who will make you a house. When your days are full and you lie with your fathers, and that's in the death, I will raise up your seed after you, who will issue from your loins, and I will make his kingship unshaken. He it is who will build a house for my name, and I will make the throne of his kingship unshaken forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. So should he do wrong, I will chastise him with the rod men use, and with the afflictions of humankind. But my loyalty shall not swerve from him, as I made it swerve from Saul, who I removed from before you. And your house and your kingship shall be steadfast forever, your throne unshaken forever. In accordance with all these words and in accordance with all this vision, so did Nathan speak to David. And we're going to pause it there. So what did you hear in that promise?
What was the question?
What did you hear in the promise in that vision of Nathan from God?
That he's going to save the people from all their enemies.
Okay, so we're going to establish your kingdom. Now you have to remember, this is before they were wandering around with no place to call home, and now we're going to establish a home, a house. And we've got this double play on words here: house as in lineage, and house as in literally a house. David said, "I'm going to build God a house," and God says, "And I'm going to make you a house. And who are you to make me a house?" I will make my own house, and my house will be with the people. But that time of stability, right, is going to be there. Mm-hmm. What else?
The thing what I hear is that the message is that God is not in a single place, right? He's not in that house or that house, or which ironically, you would, before we started, you were talking about the low altar and the high altar for a Saturday, and there's an element of putting God in a place when we have an altar.
Right.
I mean, I know we don't really believe it, but it sort of hints at it.
Mm-hmm.
And this message is saying the opposite. That there is, there's no location.
Right. And he has not had a location, but in this covenant, they are establishing the temple as a location for God to reside. And that was their understanding of the Holy of Holies. The God's real presence was in this real room where the altar would reside. I mean, at the ark, excuse me, not the altar, the ark would reside. And Ian, if you look at our architecture, we still, the sanctuary where we have the altar is the Holy of Holies. It mirrors that. And then we have where the people come and kneel, the holy place. And only certain people can go into the Holy of Holies up by the altar. Once again, we don't act it that way, but during the service we do. Yeah.
And some years ago, I did some work in Russia, and of course the Orthodox churches, the altar is, the regular folks. Good luck,
Right.
It's totally off limits.
Right. And in my lifetime, went from the altar being against the wall with the priest back to where now I go behind the altar, and as big as I am, I barely fit in our church behind the altar. I have to squeeze in there. It's distinctly different, but that architecture mirrors the temple setup. Exactly, yeah. What else? Did you notice how the verb quake there and then unshakable? The altar was trying to get that the Hebrew parallelism there. Before you were quaked, but then we will be unshakable, unquakeable. Yeah.
I mean, altar wouldn't have gone into New Testament, but I mean, that was the whole thing that the temple earthquake when Christ, the old covenant was completed, and, everybody quaked.
Right. Well, and at the death of Christ on the cross, it is explicit in the New Testament. There was an earthquake. Jerusalem was shaken, and the temple in the Holy of Holies was ripped from the top to the bottom. When you got a 40-foot curtain, unless you're up a ladder, it's hard to rip it from the top. Only God can do that, and that's that imagery cannot be lost. Exactly. What else?
I wanted to listen to your first part, where Saul says, "See, now I am living in the house of cedar, for God, the ark of God stays in a tent." And then further down, I think Nathan is talking to David, and he's saying practically the same thing.
So in the first part, David is saying to Nathan, "I want to build God a house."
Yeah.
And so that night, Nathan's like, "Go ahead, do whatever your heart wants." And then that night, God wakes Nathan up in a dream or a vision and says, "No, it's not your place to build me a house. It's my place to build myself a house. I will establish your house, both as the lineage, and I will establish my house, the temple." Mm-hmm. And we're going to come back to that. It's not, the story's not done yet, but we
So
start.
the house is also the progeny.
Right. So it's that double meaning of house. And once again, because we're not reading the Hebrew, but it's definitely in the footnotes as you dig through it.
Does the Hebrew have the same double meaning?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The word for house and house is,
Yes.
the pun is there.
Right. Which is why altar emphasizes it so much. Like he did quake and shake, unshakable. Yeah. Anything else?
I like it that the name, there's gonna be a house for the name, something we can in awe say. So thank you, David, for making this offer to me, but you can use my name in this house.
Right. And he's establishing this house for his name in Jerusalem. And and that's that funneling that we've been talking about. So we have this very ambiguous God that says, "Come all the way over here from the land of Abraham, and I will establish this promise in this land." And then they get taken out of the land, and they get brought back to the land. And in the land, he's going to establish himself in a city with a lineage. We keep getting this narrowing down to get closer and closer to the promise that we're going to have with the final covenant. Yeah. And this is one reason why in the book of Hebrews, they emphasize this very obscure chapter with Abraham, where he goes to the king of Salem, which is Jerusalem, and that Melchizedek, this kingly priest in the high order of Melchizedek, and David, with his covenant with God, is a priestly king. Just like, and once again, I was, just because I got back from England, this idea of the queen being the head of the church and the head of the state. It rubs against our American sensibilities pretty drastically. But if you saw the pictures from the funeral today, it was pretty powerful imagery. Yeah. With the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Queen, yeah. All right. Anything else before we move on? So starting with verse 18. And King David came and sat before Yahweh and said, Who am I, Yahweh God, and what is my house that you have brought me this far? And even this is too little in your eyes, Yahweh God, for you have also spoken of your servant's house in a distant time, and this is a man's instruction, Yahweh God. And how can David speak more to you when you know your servant, Yahweh God? For the sake of your word and according to your heart, you have done all these great things to make known to your servant. Therefore are you great, O Lord, our Yahweh God, for there is none like you, and there is no God beside you. And all we have heard with our own ears. And who is like your people Israel, a unique nation upon earth, whom a God has gone out to redeem as a people, to make him a name, and to do great and awesome things for them, to drive out from before your people whom you redeemed from Egypt nations with their gods. And you made your own people, Israel, unshaken forever, and you, O Yahweh, became their God. And now, Yahweh God, the word that you have spoken to your servant concerning your house, make it stand forever, and do as you have spoken. And may your name be great forever, so it is said. Yahweh of armies is God over Israel, and the house of David, your servant, shall be unshaken before you. For you, O Yahweh of armies, God of Israel, have revealed to your servant, saying, A house will I build you. Therefore has your servant found the heart to pray to you this prayer. And now, O Yahweh God, you are God, and your words must be truth. You have spoken of this bounty to your servant. And now have the goodness to bless the house of your servant, to be before you forever, for it is you, Yahweh God, who have spoken. And with your blessings may your servant's house be blessed forever. As we look at this final section, this covenanting with God through this prayer of David, the priestly king, we see this idea of accepting the covenant, but also that faithfulness, and his faith was seen unto him as righteousness with Abraham. And then we also have this idea of those blessings, and in the final verse there, blessings are mentioned 3 times. Bless your house. The blessings, may your servant's house be blessed forever. This repeated leaning on that. As we see this, there's a couple different ways to see this covenant. Now, we talked about how usually it's on a mountain, and Jerusalem is on a mountain. Several hills, in fact, kind of like Richmond, the 7 hills of Richmond, and I don't know how many hills Jerusalem has, but many. But Mount Zion there, or Mount Moriah, if our Muslim brothers and sisters are right. Then looking at also this idea of blood. Now, there's no blood explicit in this covenant, and so that leads us to, once again, it's a type, so it doesn't necessarily have to match up entirely. But one of the things that came out in some of the research I was doing is this reinstitution of the Abrahamic covenant or a reinstitution of the Mosaic covenant? If you look at it as a reinstitution of the Abrahamic covenant, that God made a covenant with Abraham to establish a nation, and then the fulfillment of that was the covenant with God where you have the laws that are around it. So you make this relationship, and then we build up to this promise with the 10 Commandments. And then we have this secondary Abraham where the covenant is reestablished. Once again, the sign of the covenant would be maintained with the circumcision that was done with Abraham. And then that lineage where, if the kings keep the promise, the nation will be blessed. And if the kings break the promise, the nation will be cursed, which leads to the Babylonian exile, where Manasseh was a really bad guy and set up an idol in the temple. And so, but then we finally get where it's the new law, the new covenant that is with Christ. So if it's a reintroduction of the Abrahamic covenant, it's very easy to see that. If it's a reintroduction of the Mosaic covenant, where we see this law established and we have this one-on-one relationship with God. And it's more of a contract where the rules must be kept.
And the consequences if you don't.
Right, which would be the removal of God's name from the city. I tend to think of it as both. I think it is a continuation in many ways of both covenants, and hence the framework aspect. But the promise to David that there would be a person of his line on the throne forever, when we get to this idea of David being a priestly king, like Melchizedek was a priestly king, where it's the head of the state religion, for lack of a better word, the church, as in the Church of England, but the head of the church and the head of the state. For Jesus to be the head and the priestly king of this kingdom of God that's being established forever, where the funnel goes back out and is spread to all people, so that the fulfillment of that promise of Abraham, that you will be a blessing to all nations, that it funnels down to get us to the point of Jesus, and through Jesus is funneled back out. We're wrestling with some really big ideas. It's hard to encapsulate them down. What else did you hear in that prayer of David to God? There's a lot in there.
I just feel like he's going, okay, I heard from this guy Nathan that you promised these things. I'm just verifying that you promised that you're gonna take care of this house, you're gonna be the God of the armies, nobody's gonna be quaking, like rechecking that this is the covenant, that you're.
And if so, I'm signing on.
Right.
Yep.
I
Yeah.
agree.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it seems, I'm guessing a bit here, but it seems a bit, up till now, it's been talking about the nation of Israel, or the people of Israel. What David seemed to be inventing here is the Jews, the concept of Jewishness. That it's outside a nation or a particular person. The concept that you are a people, but you're not in one place. You can be everywhere,
Mm-hmm.
which of course the Jews are.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I'm making sense, but
You are, and
David is the first, in this sense, the first Jew.
And you're making a very subtle argument that I don't think you're making. So, if you look at when the covenant is broken, because this Jerusalem being the center of and I'm going to use the word cultic, not as in cults, but as in the state religion, and the cultic practices around the temple, we see that Jerusalem stays with the Davidic dynasty for 250 years, which in that day and time, that's a long dynasty. Longer than the 18th dynasty in Egypt. But if we see this idea of the lineage staying with David, when the kingdom separates and the 10 tribes in the north become Israel, and then the 2 tribes in the south with Jerusalem become Judah, and hence the word that you just asked about, Jews, that come from Judah. And so, in a real sense, you're right. That's where we get the name Jew from. Juden, in the German.
But the whole point about there not being a physical location, to me is what I'm getting out of this, that God is saying, no, I don't want a house. Explicitly. I don't want a house, therefore I want you to be everywhere. Or you can be everywhere.
Well, it gets to that eventually, but he's actually the opposite. I don't want you to make me a house. I'm going to establish my house.
Solomon can do that.
Right. Mm-hmm. Through God. And, the idea of the high holy places that were where the ark would hang out, where the tabernacle and the tents would go as they wandered around, that we're getting away from that. And it establishes them as for lack of a better word, a real nation, a real country, instead of roaming nomadic herdsmen. and tribes. So
What year would this be?
1,000.
1,000.
Mm-hmm. So, and if you noticed in the article that I linked to in my article this morning, absolutely fascinating. I don't know if it's true. I really want it to be, but that we found the oldest archaeological evidence of the name of Yahweh in an archaeological find. But if you didn't read that part of of my article this morning, I put a link into it. But it's where they found this curse in a lead tablet, and it said, curse, 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 in the name of Yahweh, curse, 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 and then it's taken into lead and it's folded over so that, and that's the first. They according to the dating that they put on it, it's about 1200. And once again, as we read the Bible, we take the name Yahweh back much further than that. But to find archaeological evidence that it was used in 1200, and they said it could even be as late as 1400 BCE, which is absolutely fascinating. The more and more we do the archaeology, the more and more we find that the stories we have are historically accurate. About 10 years ago, we found Goliath inscribed on a Philistine wall, and that was really cool. But just saw that article yesterday, and my inner church geek got excited about that. Anything else from the prayer here?
Strikes me, I may be wrong, or maybe we're not remembering correctly, but in none of the previous covenants was there a verbal response. It was just go out and do what you know. It actually speaking.
Right. It has been unilateral. Mm-hmm. And here we get this affirmation. And here covenant is implied. So, but it is follows the same rubric. And the word where it really makes it explicit, and I'm trying to remember where it is in here, sorry. The Hebrew word is hesed, like Hanukkah with the aspirated H on there. But it means covenant fidelity. Sorry. I'm trying to remember where it is. My apologies.
Do you think man's just gotten older with God? I mean, like time passing?
Well, and also and who tells the story? That could be as well. There could have been responses and they just didn't write it down. It's more important to hear what God says
Than human fact.
And this isn't David telling the story here. And so they emphasize his alignment with the covenant. It could be any of those. Yeah. But this idea of and once again, I was sure I'm not firing on all cylinders tonight. But the word hesed is a huge part of the prophets to come, because they kept wrestling with this covenant fidelity. Is God going to stay true to us if we stay true to God? And it is explicit in here. But thank you for picking up on that, George. Yes.
Footnote 15.
Sorry, verse 15?
Footnote 15.
Footnote 15.
Thank you. Yes, that's where it is.
Yeah.
And so that is in the text before the break. But my loyalty shall not swerve from him as I made it swerve from Saul. So my loyalty, my covenant fidelity, my chesed. Yes, thank you. That's what I was looking for. I couldn't find it. Thank you.
This is off the wall, but what happens to all the people who get displaced who are not followers of Yahweh? Are they just completely demolished? Are they murdered? Are they, I mean, there's all these wars, I know, but, I mean, are they deserving of having their land taken from them? I'm sorry, I've got, you know.
No, don't be sorry.
Ukraine on the brain.
No, that's you know, that as we wrestle with this, we talked, you know, last week about the judgment on Egypt. You know, in our modern ears, that's really hard for us to hear. And what do we do with that? What do we do with the folks that stray? Mm-hmm. And as we wrestle with that, and how we see that, I remember the first time I really remember asking that question. There's a wonderful book called Blood Brothers by a Palestinian Orthodox priest. His name is Elias Shakur, and he talks about how the Jews and the Arabs are blood brothers, and it goes back to Isaac and Ishmael. And he said, you know, we're Christians, and 90% of the Palestinian Arabs were Christian until the Christian world turned their back on them as they had their land taken from them. And now 90% of Palestinians are Muslim because the Arabs stood with them. And that was very telling. And he was asking, and then his whole premise of his book was that God does not kill, which makes you read the Old Testament very differently. And does God demand us to kill, or have we misheard God? Kind of like when we were reading about the binding of Isaac, and Abraham's got the knife raised, and God stays his hand. When we went in and destroyed all these peoples, was it just a mishearing of God? And that's what Elias Shakur would say. And I remember when I was in seminary, I'm like, I was holding my head in my hands because like this doesn't compute because it goes against the literal reading that I had always had. But maybe rethink things. Yeah. Sorry, John, you had your hand raised?
I think I understood the question, or maybe I'm reading too much into it, from Sylvia. We don't hear in this text, we don't hear who it is that he's displacing. Is that what you was, if the archaeology you were talking about, and you use the word 1200,
Mm-hmm.
that's BC.
Correct.
How common was monotheism in 1200 BC?
Non-existent.
And so 1700 years later, the prophet of peace falls out of Medina and starts a conflagration, internecine, interfamiliar,
Mm-hmm.
saying that every Jew must die.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know whether current controversies and contentions are the subject of what Sylvia's question was, but I don't know how many different gods were being worshipped, gods from Egypt with the sun god and the snake god and everything. I don't know. I have no idea. 1200 BC, 3200 years later. ago, I don't know.
Right. Many, 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 and
So it probably, if the king is the man who grew from the child who threw a stone and killed a giant, I don't see that there's any connection, given that it's 1200 BC, before the Common Era.
well, like I said, this would have been about 1,000.
Even if it were 10 years,
Sure.
I don't see that it's significant.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, there's slavery all over Africa. The United Nations has an office of slavery, keeping track of all the countries based, and slavery typically is Muslim slave holders. So, I don't have any, I, in my white privilege, don't see any problem with David not referring to each little tribe that he's beating up on.
Sure. Once again, it comes back to how you read it. And to go back to the original question of, about monotheism, we start to see the development here where he's saying, you are stand alone among the gods, committing to our people to set us apart from all the nations with all their gods. And that God is stepping into history and selecting us.
Here's what I found.
I'm not talking to Siri. As
We're not gonna sell that here, I know, and it is true typically that the texts that survive are the texts that came from the victors in the battle. So,
But we do see, and we talked about the Babylonian exile, that is where the transition begins to take place, where this idea of this God committed to a nation on this plot of land shifts, because the people from this land are taken out of this plot of land and taken away. Will God hear their prayers? And many of the folks would grab a sack of dirt to stand on to say their prayers so that God would still hear them, because that's how much they tied their understanding of God to the land. But when they were taken off into the Babylonian exile and we begin the synagogue movement, and they trust that God will hear their prayers even in, along the shores in Babylon, in the Tigris and Euphrates Valley, that's where they start to say, it really is, there is only one God. And we start to see this understanding of monotheism. And that's where as far as what we have in the texts go, there's leanings towards that earlier, but that's where it becomes much more explicit. That God is the God, not a God amongst gods. Yeah, and it's a very different concept. Yeah.
the people whom you redeemed from Egypt, nations with their gods.
Highly recommend a wonderful book by James Michener. It's a little fantastical, but if you like big Michener novels, The Source. It's wonderful because it's told in two perspectives. So it's episodic in that it tells the story of this city, and it goes forward in time, and then they're digging archaeologically backwards in time. It's on the Tell, this mound that's built up over the millennia. And so you have this double direction story. And it's...
Are you familiar with the series Hinges of History, Caleb? The Gifts of the Jews? And I recommend at least 5 of the 6 hinges to be read by people of faith.
Neat. Sorry, we chased a lot of rabbits there. Any other explicit questions? So as we springboard off tonight's covenant, this idea of, through Adam, we're all affected. Through Noah, all of creation is focused in on this movement towards presence with God. Through Abraham and the calling of Abraham to begin the process. Moses, the covenant with the promises and how to live a good life. David, directing us towards this lineage where God steps into history. And so much so when we get to Jesus, who is both the Son of God and the Son of David. And this is where we get this crux point where we have Jesus who can be this priestly king and God stepping into history, not with promises, but with the Son of God, with Jesus the Christ, where he's both and, both Son of God and Son of David. There's a reason why, especially in Matthew, they emphasize that so much. And we really have to see it through all of these promises and through these covenants for it to really make sense. Because we don't think with the salvation of the peoples. We really do individualize it much, much more. Yeah. Anything else tonight? All right. Well, we're going to wrap it up for tonight. Thank you for being here. Next week, I will probably go long. So I'm forewarning you just a little bit because we're not only going to look at the covenant with Christ, but also get a glimpse of the revelation in John of Patmos and what we're building towards. All right. Thank you so much.
Good. Thank you.